Welcome to the COFAC ROARing Twenties podcast series. Today, we'll hear from Hannah Brancato, a community-based artist who is currently teaching her course, Art and Resistance.
I got started thinking about the role of art in resistance to oppression through my own work with the artist collective Force Upsetting Rape Culture, which I co-founded in 2010, and I was a part of the collective until just this past January 2020, so for 10 years. And we were working together collectively in the last few years and as a collaborative pair for the first few years to create art actions to disrupt the culture of rape, to bring people's attention to rape culture, to popularize the idea of consent, and to give people tools to see where they could intervene in something like rape culture that seems so prevalent that it's a problem that can't be solved. Where do you even begin? And so we always saw our role at Force as giving people tools to feel some hope in their efforts and some hope in their resistance. And I think our work really paid off. I think during the time that we were working alongside lots of other activists around the country, conversations about intersectionality, how rape culture is intertwined with white supremacy have become more understood. I think the idea of consent is a more mainstream idea, which is something that we were always fighting for. And there's still work to do on college campuses, for example. A lot of Title IX rollbacks that activists really worked hard for in 2013, 2014 have been rolled back. But again, the good news is that we know that through our efforts that we can organize together and resist and fight back. And so the project that Force is most known for is the Monument Quilt, which was a 6-year-long project where we collected survivor stories on red quilt squares and blanketed highly public spaces to create a public space for healing that was centered on the needs of survivors. And we displayed the quilt 50 times around the country and in Mexico, culminating in a final display on the National Mall in June of 2019. And so just the experience of being part of that project and some of the difficult lessons that I learned about my own role as a white person in activist work, the ways that white supremacy culture can be replicated within activist groups, even unconsciously and even when it's not our intention. And also the joyful and hopeful things that I learned about how powerful it is when people tell their individual stories together in a collective space and how much of a shift it can make in individual people's lives, but also in the culture at large and how we understand issues that we're up against. That's all influencing my approach to this class and my interest now that I'm not part of Force in taking a step back and seeing the broader landscape and the history that our work has fit into and been a part of. Because of course we've built on the shoulders and learned so much from so many other activists that came before us. One thing that we're doing with the Art and Resistance class is making the syllabus and some of the course content, what we're doing week to week, what we're reading, what we're watching, and some of the student work as well publicly available, which is something that in the time of, online learning, I really believe that this is an opportunity to increase the accessibility of education for people who can't attend college or are not attending college for one reason or another. So people can find that class website at my website, hannahbrancato.com. If you go to workshops, there's a link to a Google site there. And the Google site is sites.google.com/art and resistance. So people are welcome and invited to follow along with the class. And in particular, the artist interviews where students are interviewing artistic activists, and this is going to be a growing archive that will be added to semester. Those are all being cataloged on our Art and Resistance website, so join us. So here in 2020, I've been reflecting on the fact that people are experiencing so many crises and changes at once. The global pandemic and resulting economic fallout, the climate crisis, racist violence, and police brutality. And at the same time, people are resisting and fighting back as they always have and as they always will, particularly through the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the seismic and structural changes that activists are calling for regarding defunding the police and reconsidering whose perspective is centered in the telling and documentation of American history. We're seeing mutual aid projects to help folks struggling during the pandemic. We're seeing calls to remove monuments to Confederate figures and conquistadors and others who represent oppression. The shift in cities and states across the country to reclaim Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day, as folks in Baltimore City have been working on. And these are just a few examples of the ways that people are organizing and fighting back during what's been a really difficult year. So this semester feels like a relevant and pressing time to be teaching a new class that I developed recently with a section here at Towson and one also at UMBC, Art and Resistance. And the goal of Art and Resistance is really to understand the role of culture in creating social change, and particularly in working towards social justice. So what we're looking at is the essential role of art in social resistance to dominant culture. Through the class, we're looking at examples in contemporary times as well as through history, and examining how when social activists tell their own stories to counter mainstream narratives through visual forms, they can capture the public imagination and create room to envision new realities. So the students are working on a variety of different kinds of projects. They have studied through a variety of different means existing artistic activists by making people's history posters in the style of the Just Seeds Collective People's History series. They're currently interviewing artists and activists from the Baltimore area and beyond. And each week they're also doing like an individual kind of self-reflection about their own identity, who they are, and how they fit into everything that's been going on in the world around us. So kind of examining their own experiences of privilege and oppression and thinking about their gifts as creative people and what it is that they can bring to enrich the ongoing work and conversations about where we go from here. And so even though it's been such a difficult time, I think a class like this is really designed to help us be rooted in history and understand that people have always been up against a lot, and that we, work together as a way of overcoming and moving forward. And a time of crisis is a time to also see lasting change happen. And so although this is a really difficult year, I think it's also a hopeful year in that way. When I look back to 1920 or the 1920s compared to where we are now, there were a lot of seismic changes that are parallel to where we're at here in 2020. There was just a global pandemic that had happened in 1918, the women's suffrage movement, and the women's right to vote in 1920. And of course, along with the women's right to vote, also the kind of history of first wave feminism not being an intersectional movement, of white feminism not taking into account the interests of like an intersectional feminism. And so, again, I hope by taking the time to look at our history and understand it more deeply, we can learn from it and build on it, to try to deepen our work and avoid making some of the same mistakes again.